Yeah, I'm gonna borrow all.
Yeah, we're recording. Let me just share his screen.
That's not Joel.
No, he's not here yet. I'm gonna email him right now. But we have Matt first. Matthew. So I'm just gonna set things up for him, and I'm gonna go see Matthew Bolton. Matthew Bolton, yeah.
Matt, is he with us?
Yeah, he's right here.
I'm looking for you on the computer. So I'm looking for you on the computer.
No, I'm here.
You look good. How are you? So have a seat. Nice to see you.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for being here.
Awesome, thank you. Are you Joel? I'm not Joel. Joel is in the ether somewhere. Yeah.
No, of course. Here you go.
Okay, we're gonna start.
No, I think you have to just really embrace it.
Where's everybody? Welcome back. So we have one session this afternoon as Shabbat approaches. Okay, so today we have Daphne is
Not yet. Sorry.
While we wait, does anybody have any comments or questions or thoughts? So apparently nothing is happening at Chabad tonight, is that true?
Well, so they said they don't have a dinner, but if you want like challah and wine.
We could get challah and wine at least.
No, this is what the congregation said.
No, she spoke to them.
Yeah,
you talk to Chabad as well?
Chabad as well, yeah. But there is a shul service at the main Oxford shul.
At one time?
Yeah. They didn't give me the time yet because you have to give them your names first
Okay,
for
yeah.
security. Yeah.
So talk about anti-Semitism, right?
Yeah.
There's a synagogue, and you need to give them their names. They have to check you out for security reasons.
Yeah.
Standard.
So imagine.
Standard.
It's standard by
I
this point.
know.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's at 7:30.
It's
Yeah.
a new thing also in, my parents lived near Boynton Beach, Florida, which is a very semi-rural place.
Also there.
Iron garments, and you have to...
And people don't realize it. When I told non-Jewish friends about it, they're like, really? People don't know that
Yeah.
we have to have guards and whatever else. Which kind of makes sense, I guess.
One other thing, a friend of mine is a psychologist, so we had an office in New York City. If you can have an office in New York City, that's like sort of you made it, right? If you make it in New York, you can do it in New York.
Where's this guy?
And we noticed that Jewish organizations in New York, this has been going on for decades, do not put their names in lights, right? It's kind of quiet, and there's cement blocks on the sidewalks. But, as I said, when we went to the United Arab Emirates, doors are open, we walked in, no
Also in
problem.
Bahrain.
Pardon?
Also in Bahrain, people were
Yeah.
shocked. They saw it without any security, without any.
So I said the story, I was late for Shabbat, so in Dubai, there's a gated door, so I knocked on the gate, you can't ring the bell on Shabbat. So I eventually opened the door, looked in the courtyard, walked into the courtyard, then I saw the door to the house in the synagogue, knocked on the door, nobody answered, so I eventually, after a while, I had the courage, I opened the door, walked in, people were praying, they don't lock the doors. And here in Oxford, an international multicultural center of democracy, this is what's going on. But we're going to have more workshops. There's business for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Click the button?
No, the dongle.
Oh,
that.
This one. Is Joel with us?
Not yet, but I emailed him.
Okay. Should we start?
Yeah, we can do Matthew first.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
All right. So we have a very important session. And we have two great scholars, and I don't use the word loosely. They are great. They're doing amazing work. First we have Matthew Bolton. Matthew is a researcher of the Decoding Antisemitism project, which is connected to the term for an Institute for Antisemitism in Berlin, at the Technical University of Berlin. He's written widely on issues of anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism in the UK, including a book, an important book, on Corbynism, A Critical Approach, published by Emerald in 2018. And he's a fellow at the London Centre for Contemporary Anti-Semitism. So thank you for being here. And Joel Finkelstein shall hopefully join us momentarily. Joel is the head of the NCRI, the Network Contingent Research Institute, which looks at uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to look at growing patterns of hatred and extremism in social media. He's also a visiting scholar at the Madison Project Program of Ideas and Institutions at Princeton University, and a former research fellow at the Anti-Defamation League. He's also published widely. And Joel and his team is actually working on a project with us where we're looking at the influence of soft power. And Harris and I will speak about it next week. We're looking at how the Muslim Brotherhood has been funding American universities for over 40 years. We found $3 billion, and there's a lot more to be found. And we're looking at how funding is actually shifting discourse when it comes to Jews, Israel, and Zionism. And how basically the discourse in academia has been, I don't know if it's hijacked, but significantly influenced by this soft power of funding. So Matthew will start first. Matthew's title of his talk is Jew Hatred on the Internet, Reflections, Methods, and Goals of the Decoding Anti-Semitism Project. And his colleague, Matthias Becker, was in Cambridge with us. And then Joel, he's going to speak about online anti-Semitism and social media. So Matthew, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So basically I'm going to introduce to you what the Decoding Anti-Semitism Project is, what's the kind of the logic, the idea behind it, how we work, how we differ from other projects and programs that are looking at anti-Semitism online, how it kind of currently manifests. The broad aim of the project is to kind of analyse the frequency, the content, and importantly the kind of the linguistic structure of anti-Semitism online. And we're looking initially at the UK or kind of English speaking language communities online, France and Germany. So we've got teams of people in the UK, in France and Germany, looking at how anti-Semitism online, particularly social media threads, comment sections of newspapers and stuff, how that is expressed, not just in terms of the content, but also kind of the way that sentences are structured to kind of convey implicit meanings, implicit forms of anti-Semitism that might not be instantly kind of recognised, especially by social media moderators who might not know that much about how anti-Semitism kind of manifests. So I'm going to give you a kind of introduction to the rationale of the project and how it works. So the broad kind of disciplinary background of the project, it tries to combine applied linguistics, critical discourse analysis, cognitive linguistics, anti-Semitism studies, internet studies, and machine learning approaches. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that as we go on. So just to give you a kind of, I'm sure you're aware of this, but just to give you a kind of broad outline of the problem, the scope of the problem of anti-Semitism online today. As we all are aware, the internet is becoming, if not already, the kind of primary source through which people obtain information, exchange opinions, and it's becoming a really key driver in the spread and the development of anti-Semitic ideas, concepts, and images. And we kind of think that this is a new development in previous eras. If you go back through history, back to as far as medieval times before that, or turn of modernity, anti-Semitic discourse was a kind of primarily a top-down driven thing, not solely, but primarily a top-down driven thing. So you'd get kind of, it would come from pamphlets, it would come from speeches, political leaders, religious kind of teachings, and it would come top-down and it would spread throughout society from there. Whereas with the development of the internet, and particularly the development of kind of Web 2.0, which is, I don't know, what is it, the 2010s or something, it becomes much more interactive. There are new communication dynamics being created, and the process of information flow transforms, and it becomes much more a kind of bottom-up process. There's a cacophony of voices, people talking all the time to each other. When you do have kind of top-down kind of means of communication, whether that's newspaper articles or whatever, you know, you just go through the comment threads of any newspaper article or social media to see that the users are kind of reworking the message that's in the article. They're reworking, they're pushing back, they're extending, they're bringing new information in, and there's this constant process of push and pull from top down to bottom up. We have new kind of conditions of communication, anonymity online, which might allow people to say things that they might not say, you know, to someone's face or if their name's attached to it. There's mutual reinforcement, the creation of filter bubbles, or people kind of pushing each other and going to more and more extreme positions and creating these kind of feedback loops of information. There's the kind of slow but kind of steady collapse of older communication conventions in terms of what's acceptable to say in public. You know, previously you might have newspapers which would often be regulated by some kind of, certainly in the UK, about law about what they can and can't say. The internet is much more of a kind of Wild West in terms of what's permissible to say. And so we have this kind of shifting boundary, and one of the kind of motivations behind the project is to what extent are these changes kind of expanding the space and expanding the means through which people are able to say anti-Semitic stuff or spread anti-Semitic ideas without challenge, and the problems that social media companies have in kind of first recognizing it and doing anything about it. Because I'm sure you've all had experience, or know people who have had experience who have had kind of, you know, really viciously anti-Semitic tweets or whatever, and Twitter just doesn't understand it or doesn't get it. And conversely, the other way, I know people who have tried to push back against anti-Semitism and have been flagged for anti-Semitism, perhaps because of the language that they've used. And so we're trying to think about how can we grapple with this problem, because there's obviously a need for academia and, you know, broader civil society and political agencies to come to terms with the way that internet discourse works and stop using kind of methods that might be appropriate for older forms of discourse and communication. They might not work in a kind of new communicative environment. So in some ways it's a problem, but there are new opportunities as well, particularly of kind of really getting an accurate picture of what social attitudes actually are. You know, how many people do think certain things? And I think we think that the internet offers a kind of pretty unprecedented opportunity to getting that. Because if you think about it, the classic way of kind of working out social attitudes or kind of gauging social attitudes would be like a survey, right? In social sciences, that's the classic way of doing it. You set up a survey and you get people to answer it. And you can get some useful insights from that, but there are some problems with surveys, as have been, you know, well recorded within social sciences for many years. There are kind of priming effects. The way that the question is phrased might kind of shape the way that people respond to the question. There's self-censorship. You know, if you ask a certain question, people might know that they shouldn't say that, right, in a public thing or potentially public space, so they won't answer truthfully, right? In Germany, if you ask, you know, do you think Jews have too much power in society? Very few German people, unless they're really hardcore neo-Nazis, are going to say, yes, I do think that. Like, because they know that within the German kind of mainstream culture, at least, that's not something you should say, which doesn't mean they don't think it, right? So just because they don't say it doesn't mean that that attitude doesn't still exist. So those problems of priming effects, censorship, social disapproval and stuff can have cause big issues in terms of actually us understanding the scale of the problem. Now, one of the main ways in which people in internet studies try and kind of grasp the scale of the problem on the internet is through a kind of what we think of as kind of quantitative approaches. And again, they can have some insight. So we've got some good examples here, I think, somewhere. There we go. So ADL, right, for example, the way that these kind of things work is they have like a list of, it's called a bag of words approach, right? So you have a bag of keywords like insults or whatever, you know, and they search on a particular forum or on Twitter, this is on 4chan, and they look for all the kind of, moments when that word has been used, and they track it, right? So they've tracked it. This is like Trump's election, the inauguration, Charlottesville, and they're tracking few kind of like some of these like racially abusive terms or whatever, and seeing when they appear and when there's rises and falls. And so there's some benefits to that. Other ways of doing it might be through kind of heat mapping, where you kind of see where regionally where words are being used a lot at certain points, or these kind of big kind of graphs or whatever, where you show, okay, these words are used in conjunction with other words. Is there a kind of network of language use or whatever? And there's something really important about that, but it's a bit of a blunt tool. It's not really, it doesn't get to the real detail of how words are used in internet communication, because there's all these other layers to the way that we all talk on the internet, right? We don't all speak in these kind of literalistic words, and you can use these terms, any of these words that have been searched for, in any number of ways. And just because you might use that word doesn't mean that you're using it in a racist sense. And conversely, and it means that there are other ways of communicating racism which might not use any of those words, right? Some of the most viciously anti-Semitic and racist kind of tweets or comments or whatever may not use, they might not use the word Jew at all. It might not come in, but the message that's being communicated actually is extremely anti-Semitic and extremely racist. And the bag of words approach doesn't have any means to grasp that, really. So that's one reason why I think social media companies are struggling, because the kind of programs that they use to pick up on this stuff just cannot come to terms with the complexity of the way that language actually works when we use it. So these are some of the kind of ways, the different levels, if you like, that anti-Semitic speech online can be communicated. Right, so you can use kind of semiotic markers, the three brackets thing. Now that's an interesting one straight away, because it was used, I think it was used initially as a kind of, I can't remember which way it came, you guys will know. Did it come from the far right and then was co-opted, or was it?
So, yeah.
Yeah, but it's used, and it was kind of co-opted and then used by people to try and undermine the far right's attempts to kind of put all Jewish names in three brackets. So the three brackets on its own now doesn't really tell you that much, but it's depending on the context and when it's used, it carries different meanings. You have memes, you have emojis, you have GIFs. There's kind of wordplay and puns, all of these things I'm sure you're very familiar with. Zionazis, Israel with a $sign, all of this kind of stuff. And that's constantly changing as well. It's constantly developing. There's fashions in the way that these things get used. There are allusions, so perhaps talking about East Coast bankers, the lobby that calls the shots, deep state globalists, NWO. I mean, those three, again, are good examples, because they can be used in an anti-Semitic way, but they don't necessarily have to be. So it's no good just building a program that flags up every time someone talks about the deep state and says, beep, 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 this is anti-Semitic, because that won't be true. But that doesn't mean that sometimes it is. And that way of thinking can lead itself into anti-Semitic thinking. So that's another one where you really need to think about context and the way that the particular comment has been structured. You might have implicit Nazi comparisons, talking about Gaza as a concentration camp or as genocide, or using terms about final solution, extermination war when you're talking about Israel-Palestine conflict. These kind of things are kind of Nazi comparisons, which in a German context would be extremely kind of socially disapproved, but there's ways in which they can be expressed, particularly when you're talking about Israel, that kind of gets around that. And then there are indirect speech acts. So indirect speech acts, again, I'm sure a lot of you know about the kind of theoretical basis of that, which is the idea that, the literal meaning of something that you say can differ from the actual meaning. And the way that you, the meaning, if you just look at look at the words literally, actually doesn't, and you don't get to grips with what the statement is actually saying. So some examples here. Who is holding out his hand once again? Who owns the British media? Did Soros pay for these interviews? Now those three are authentic examples. Each of them in the context is implying some kind of secretive, essentially Jewish influence or some kind of conspiracy or whatever. And again, those kind of comments would just not get picked up by social media algorithms, and social media moderators often don't really understand the meanings that are actually being implied through the way that those sentences are structured. So, to look at this example, it's disgusting to see how greedy these Jews are. Now this is a pretty easy one. This is one that a kind of social media moderator might understand, right? But you can see it works on two levels, the conceptual level and the verbal level. So the conceptual level is the stereotype of Jewish greed, right? And that's very easy to see because it's using the word greed and it's linking it directly with Jews and stuff, so that doesn't cause any problems. At the verbal level, it's a direct speech act, it's assertive, it is disgusting to see. There's an emotional word, disgusting, so that's kind of gives evidence of a kind of heightened emotional state when making it, and there's an explicit reproduction of a stereotype, and quite a well-known stereotype referring to Jewish people. So that isn't too complicated. But this one, who is holding out his hand once again, which was in Die Welt, German newspaper in 2015. I'm not sure exactly what it might be, something to do with German-Israeli relations, I think, geopolitical relations or something. Again, it's the same stereotype of Jewish greed, the idea that, Jews are always after money, but the way it's expressed is much more implicit and much more kind of indirect compared with the first one. It's a rhetorical question. Who is holding out his hand once again? Doesn't give the answer, just says that. And by saying that question, it puts the idea in the reader's head, right? There's a metaphor, holding out his hand, i.e. asking for money. And there's a presupposition, once again, i.e. this is a repeated thing, this happens a lot. And this isn't the first time, right? There's a pattern here. And those three levels combined to produce the concept of Jewish greed, right? But you wouldn't get that unless you analyse the structure of the sentence and the context within which it kind of takes place, right? And internet studies, particularly so that kind of ADL chart I showed you, which shows how many times certain words get used, that wouldn't pick that up. It wouldn't recognise that. So when you get people saying, okay, there's X amount of anti-Semitism online at the moment, we think that's only a very small amount of what there actually is. Because when you really start digging into it and you look at the kind of hidden or the indirect meanings, you suddenly see there's a whole lot more. So our approach, rather than just looking at quantitative, I'm not dismissing it, it's useful, but rather than just using that, we look at, we base our studies on something called qualitative corpus studies. Now what we do is we try and capture authentic kind of real world data that exists out there in the world that's being produced online every day. And it's the crucial thing is it's self-motivated, right? It's not someone being given a survey and saying, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? They're doing it, they're going online specifically to make these comments, right? So it's an authentic kind of expression of what they're doing it on their own back. So it could be written text, could be images, recordings, social media comments. And we think it gets much closer to authentic speech and how people actually act and speak when they're not really worried about someone watching them, right? When they've lost those kind of social inhibitions or whatever, it's like they're online at 2 a.m. in the morning just typing out some stuff, and they could be writing it anonymously, and we think it gives a much better picture of what people actually think. Or at least think within, there's another layer of complexity, isn't there? Because are they saying it because they want to be within an in-group or whatever? But we can think about those questions. But they're not conscious of being observed. Now, once we start looking at each comment, I'll show you in a minute how we do it, and we look at it really in depth, and we look at it both at the level of concept, the conceptual content of the comment, and we look at it in terms of the structure. And once we do that, we're able to recognise implicit meanings in a way that quantitative studies just can't do. The problem with this stuff is it's really time consuming. It takes ages. There's like 10 of us Like often we can debate about the meaning of a single comment for like 2 hours or something, have these big arguments, and like you think sometimes I think this is ridiculous. There's some idiot writing a load of crap like, and there's like 9 PhDs going, what did he actually mean, but it's important work, right? And we've now done, how many have we done? 80,000, 90,000 comments or something like that. So that's a lot, but it's still, compared with quantitative analyses, when you can do millions of comments, it's not very much. It's very difficult to make kind of socially representative claims based on that data. So you need to combine it with quantitative methods, which is what we want to do at the end, or towards the end of the project. So so this project was set up in 2020 at the Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung in Berlin. And it's in collaboration with King's College and some other kind of technical data wizard people in Berlin. And it's looking at, he wants to look at mainstream spaces. So we're not really looking at kind of extreme right spaces. We're not looking at Parler and Gab and 4chan and that. We're looking at, the comment threads on mainstream German newspapers, comment threads in mainstream British newspapers, not The Guardian, because they don't allow any comments on Israel-Palestine stories anymore, because the stuff they were getting is so bad, which is a bit annoying. But we look on their kind of, we look on their Facebook pages. So if a newspaper posts a news story on their Facebook page, we get the comments from there. We look on Twitter, we look on YouTube, we're starting to look on Instagram now. So we're really interested in mainstream spaces and thinking about how much anti-Semitism is there in these kind of mainstream online spaces, and what is the form it takes. That's the whole team. Okay, so how it works on a day-to-day basis is that the teams in each country we're always looking at the news stories and thinking what news stories might act as what we call discourse triggers for potentially anti-Semitic speech, right? So any news stories that come up or things that are getting spoken about, we mark them down, and then we try and collect relevant corpora, the comments to be analysed for each of those stories. So some examples over the last year: the Russian invasion of Ukraine, various flashpoints in the Middle East conflict, the whole David Miller case in the UK. I don't know if you're aware of that, but that was a real shocker, hardcore anti-Semite, big thing, big protest about him. So coverage of that. There were some trials of former concentration camp employees in Germany last year, I think, that we looked at. COVID protests in France around the health pass and the kind of anti-Semitism there. The boycott of Israeli publishers by the Irish author Sally Rooney. So we collect all the news stories, and then we use this thing called a crawler, which then goes online and downloads all of the comments that are on there, and it kind of turns it into like a Word document or whatever. So this is the kind of stuff that we might look at. We don't analyse all of these because not all of them will have that many comments. We look for things that have more than maybe 100 comments, because then you really get the discussion going, and you can see the kind of development of the discussion and stuff. If it's 2 or 3 comments, that doesn't really give us much to work with. I just put there was a big Russell Brand. I don't know if you know Russell Brand. He was a comedian who's now become some kind of new age guru, and he has a YouTube channel, and he just did a big session last week with a kind of conspiracy theorist guy who has loads of conspiracy theories around Russia and Syria and stuff. Anyway, and they were talking about Corbyn there, and they had a big discussion about how the whole Corbyn thing was a setup, blah blah blah. So I just downloaded 15,000 comments on YouTube about that, which I'm looking forward to digging into later. So there's this constant kind of stream of stuff, and so there's a 3-step process. After we've done that, there's qualitative content analysis. Once we've done that, the overall aim of the project is we're hoping to kind of build a kind of AI which is able to kind of mimic the decision-making process that we go through when we're picking up on implicit meanings, right? That's the idea at the end, and then once we've done that, we can then have quantitative analysis of the kind of style that the ADL would do in, but of a much greater kind of granular detail. So we get all the comments, we put them in this program called MaxQDA, which is a kind of qualitative data analysis program. So that's like your thread there. I think this is a YouTube thread about Soros. And then what we've done is we've built up, we call it a guidebook. It's kind of a code system where we've got a big long list of over 40, 50 anti-Semitic concepts, different forms of anti-Semitism, classic ones, more modern ones, Israel-related ones, conspiracy theory ones, and we've kind of come up with this, with like really nuanced, concrete definitions of how you kind of recognise them and what distinguishes one from the other. And so we've got this guidebook that all of the researchers use, and we're looking to publish the guidebook actually because we think it could be really useful for social media moderators in particular, that they have this kind of handy go-to guide where you can see, okay, this is this concept, so this is why this is anti-Semitic, and also to say why this isn't. There are some things that come close to being anti-Semitism we think aren't, and I think so we're hoping to publish that because I think it could be quite useful. So then we have all the comments here and we go through them and we kind of mark them. So we mark them on the level of concept. So this one in the blue, which is this was a BBC documentary about George Soros, and it was kind of debunking some of the conspiracy myths around George Soros. And this comment says, "This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, the Soros conspiracy theories. I suggest you, the BBC filmmakers, look into this more carefully. Those who still know what the truth is and haven't taken your 30 pieces of silver." Right? So we're looking at the kind of anti-Semitism and that. And YouTube just leave this up, right? Because they've got no idea about this stuff. And so we put it, there's a kind of, there's influence on public opinion. That's the concept that we would use there, the idea of a kind of secretive Jewish influence on public opinion. I think we'd also code it with a kind of religious reference, the 30 pieces of silver. But we also code it as contextual anti-Semitism, because if you just had that on a t-shirt, well, I don't know actually, would you be? I'm not sure I would put it as contextual. Our test is, if you had the comment on a t-shirt and you saw someone randomly walking around with it, would you know it was anti-Semitic just from reading it on the t-shirt? Or do you need to have the context of the thread or the thing? Precisely, yeah. So this one, whoever's coded this has put it as contextual. I'm not sure because of the 30 pieces of silver, I don't know. Maybe I would code it slightly differently. But anyway.
30 pieces of silver, not necessarily specifically.
Not necessarily, yeah. Oh, 5 minutes, sorry. So we then code it on the conceptual level for the stereotypes and on the verbal level, looking for metaphors, speech acts and all this kind of stuff. So to come back to the more complicated example, who's holding out his hand once again, we would code that on the conceptual level as the stereotype of Jewish greed. On the verbal level, we have rhetorical question, metaphor and presupposition. So that would be all coded on that program, which then all of that information then gets fed in to the people who are building the AI. And when you've done this thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of times, the idea is that at some point, the machine is going to be able to recognize the way that certain linguistic structures combine to create these kind of implicit meanings. Some other examples that we've been looking at. Someone needs to give Soros a shower. Now that's clearly a kind of concentration camp, extermination camp reference. Again, wouldn't get picked up by YouTube. We need a new German man with half a moustache. I think that was in an Israel-related thread, with a wink. So that's kind of affirmation of Hitler, essentially, affirmation of the Holocaust. Israelis are basically doing the same thing to the Palestinians as what Hitler did to them. So that's a Nazi analogy, a victim-perpetrator reversal. If Hitler were around, they'd tighten up and behave, affirmation of Nazis, and then smoke from him again is a kind of concentration camp reference. That's all the meaning of that is all implicit, right? You wouldn't pick that up from a kind of bag of words approach at all. Then you get some other ones. With Israel, it gets quite complicated. So Israeli lobby groups operating in Britain, Friends of Israel group controlling most of our politicians. Israel goes unpunished for ethnically cleansing. We think of those kind of terms that frame Israel's acts as, the world doesn't care or the world secretly supports it, as a kind of reworking of old ideas of Jewish privilege. This sounds like the most corrupt invasion of our own country by a foreign agent, meddling with our media and politicians, this kind of stuff. But yeah, this sounds like the most corrupt invasion of our own country by a foreign agent, meddling with our media and our politicians. You need the context to understand that is referring to kind of older ideas of Jewish influence. Again, that wouldn't get picked up just by reading it on its own. This one is another really complicated one. This is about Sally Rooney, and Sally Rooney, the author, who said she was going to boycott Israel and Israeli publishers. And this person has responded, "How dare she? We can do as we please. Dare anyone who speaks against us." Now, I think I thought about this one for a while, because literally that could be a kind of supportive position, like, we don't care, you know, we're not interested in what she says or whatever. I don't think it is. I think it's sarcastic, and actually it's saying that Jews have a kind of what's known in German context as a kind of taboo of criticism, where they kind of shape the terrain of public debate or whatever, and anyone who says anything that Jews disagree with faces punishment or whatever. So I think it's actually sarcastic, but again, you wouldn't get that from without looking at it kind of at a qualitative level.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So this is the basic program of them. What we do is, so we have the 3 different steps. So we have the guidebook over there, we have the raw data, which is the internet comments, then we have the qualitative analysis, which then creates this annotated data, which, you know, is data which now says, okay, this is this concept, this is this verbal structure. That then gets fed into the AI, which then has a go and sees if it can do it as well as we can. If it can't, that has to go back, and there's this kind of cyclical process where we're constantly pumping new data into the machine and hoping the machine can do something with it. But this constant process, constantly bringing new stuff in, is really important, because the way that anti-Semitism online works is that it's constantly changing, it's constantly shifting. There's always new memes, new jokes, new kind of like words that are used to stand in for things. And if you just stay still and just look at, you know, the language for one particular year, actually it's probably not going to help you 3 or 4 years later, because it's changing so fast. Even if the underlying concepts themselves may not be changing, right? You do have this kind of repertoire of anti-Semitic concepts which you can pick them up across time, but the way that they manifest themselves is always shifting. And this is very important, because eventually we want to build the algorithm that is able to recognise the difference between a comment that uses a key term to make an anti-Semitic statement, so a key term being like, I don't know, just Jew or something, a comment that uses the same term neutrally, and a comment that uses the key term to counter anti-Semitism. Because you get some anti-Semitic words that don't use those words at all, and others which do. So for the many, not the Jew, for example, that was a phrase that was used by campaigners against Jeremy Corbyn, because Corbyn's phrase was for the many, not the few, and so people did this kind of spoof kind of slogan that said Corbyn's Labour was for the many, not the Jew, but they kept on getting flagged up for anti-Semitism. And some of the worst people, Corbyn supporters, who said, you know, said some terribly anti-Semitic stuff, they were reporting people who were campaigning against Corbyn on the basis of this, and Twitter was going, oh yeah, it's anti-Semitic, you know. So we're hoping that through our kind of methodology we can get past that. And then the final step is that once we've got the machine and it's working fairly accurately, then we can start really getting a crawler to get in millions and millions and millions of bits of data, you know, tons and tons of comments, and really start working through that systematically, and then that will give us a much better picture. But it has to be a constant process where we're still doing the qualitative analysis, because things change so quickly. I mean, some other people that we know are doing they had to go at doing a similar project, and they had a real problem that they'd done a load of annotation of comments from, like, I don't know, 2018 or something, and then they finally got to the point where they'd built this kind of AI machine. They tried to use that on some comments from 2020, and it didn't work at all. And they reckon it was because COVID came. And because COVID came, the language that was being used on the internet completely changed. There was all these new terminology that the AI just didn't recognise at all. So it has to be this continual process to keep up with the constant development of anti-Semitism and the way that internet language works. And I think that's about it, really. We publish our results in these kind of 6 monthly discourse reports where we talk about some of the findings we've got, and these are the 3 we've done so far. I've got another one coming in September, and then hopefully the AI thing will be really getting going over the next year, and hopefully we'll have something to get our teeth into with that in the next 12 months. So yeah, thank you.
Daniel Allenson.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, we'll take Q&A in a minute. So, Joel, are you here?
Yes, he's here.
Joel?
Hey, how are you guys?
I'm good, how are you? We're going to set you up in a minute. You can see us? I can see you.
I can see everybody. Can you guys see me?
Yes.
Where are you?
Just look behind you.
Good morning, Joel.
Good morning, everybody. Well, I guess afternoon by you guys. How is everyone?
Good.
Excellent. Great. So it's my turn, right, Charles?
Indeed. You have 30 minutes.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so, well, first of all, greetings, everybody. My name is Joel Finkelstein. I am the Director and the Chief Science Officer for the Network Contingent Research Institute. We are an organization that uses scaled analyses and machine learning, neuroscience, psychology, engineering, political science, and everything under the sun in order for us to basically identify and forecast threats from the social cyber domain. So we're not really an expert organization in anti-Semitism at all, and we really are not experts in any one given kind of area. We have developed a kind of tool set that is uniquely suited towards resolving emerging threats. Now, those tools, which we use in combination with officials in law enforcement and the psychology, academics, and the intelligence analysts, like these tools have been used to assess threats of financial disinformation that are assailing markets. They've been used in combination with data from Google and Walmart to understand vaccine reluctance. And they've been used to detect emerging militia threats that, from white supremacists and accelerationists. And often the capacities that we've developed give us a unique kind of insight into these kinds of threats by studying them in the same way we would study the emergence of viruses or information contagions. Our ability to kind of model the climate of problems online often gives us insight into what's going to emerge in the real world. So today I'm going to give you an example of how we use these tools on issues of anti-Semitism in ways that can have applications for understanding the different kinds of extremist-coded languages and ideological flavors of anti-Semitism. And we're going to drill down into a specific case use for why these kinds of approaches could prove really valuable, both from a scientific standpoint and from the standpoint of critical intelligence and threat detection. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened with a report that was done by Amnesty International in February of 22. And the goal is to understand how our globe can get kind of encircled by social cyber forces that can manufacture biases in ways that really aren't reflective of reality, and that really use a lot of underhanded, non-transparent mechanisms in order to dominate the impression of specific issues in ways that are probably not healthy to having a transparent, reasonable discussion about facts. So our analysis uses machine learning. It ingests data largely from Twitter, but other platforms, and uses semantic analyses from natural language processing, which is a scaled capacity to understand language contextually with machines, and to analyze it that way. And we're looking at the influence of bots, of extremist groups, and we're trying to understand how a kind of feeding frenzy can emerge around themes of social justice in a way that is kind of arguably partisan and discriminatory. And we're going to try to understand how that happens and if it happens and what the impact of that is. So we looked at the report that Amnesty released, Amnesty International is a human rights organization that's fairly prolific and well known. And in February of 2022, they issued a report about Israel being an apartheid state, and tried to create that report justifying why they thought that title was worthwhile. So what we wanted to understand is, okay, what was the overall impact of that online? Can we see what that actually did? And then what was the online distribution and reception? What are the audiences that are disseminating this? And how do they weigh out in terms of their balance in reporting on these issues, especially with the reception of the report? Are there specific information operations, that is to say, and attempts to sway or influence that are either covert or overt in a coordinated fashion in order to fabricate consensus around highly partisan reporting or media? And finally, can we compare what happens in Israel with the reputation of other states that do things that are way more terrible to see if this was really merited? Right? In other words, is there an attention problem that needs to be addressed, that people don't know that something like apartheid is happening in Israel? Is there even-handed approach in the application of the language and the concerns of human rights? So that's the sort of goal of the report. So the first thing we did was we used scaled analyses and time series in order to understand the overall impact of the report. What we found was that when the report came out, there was roughly a doubling in the mention of the term Zionist, but there was nearly an increase by order of magnitude in terms that relate to apartheid. So the top associations with Israel that as this came out were all about the conflict, accusations of apartheid. There's a couple of really interesting hashtags that showed up: End Israeli Apartheid, Apartheid Israel. And you can see here this increase by roughly an order of magnitude when the Amnesty report actually came out in mentions of the term apartheid. So that's pretty substantial, but it went down to baseline fairly quickly after the report came out. Now, the thing to notice about the report is that, we saw that this increase in activity, we saw associations of apartheid and demonizing social justice slogans becoming the top hashtags associated with Israel across all of Twitter. So when you look up the term apartheid, these are the top associated hashtags: End Israeli Apartheid, Free Palestine, BDS, Apartheid Israel, Palestine, Dismantle Apartheid. It's virtually all about Israel, with some interesting ones like Israeli crimes and End Israeli Apartheid. Well, that's interesting, because what that suggests is that these campaigns can cause a dislocation of the language of human rights, so that words such as apartheid come to mean one and only one nation, and not for a small network of people, but for an entire platform. That suggests that the language is being dislocated in ways that are partisan. So this huge increase in apartheid chatter by an order of magnitude, it's not that Israel becomes about apartheid, it's that apartheid becomes all about Israel. And that's like a conspiracy. Whenever you have this kind of unilateral villainization with a kind of colorful magnitude that's on one and only one country, that's a kind of dominance conspiracy that's being generated at a huge scale. So let's talk about the online distribution and reception of the report. We looked at the associated URLs, the websites that were associated with terms like Zionist, apartheid, etc. after the report's release. And what we found was that of the top 20 URLs that were shared the most, that most of them came from what I would call the usual suspects. These are organizations that when they report on the subject of affairs in the Middle East, especially as it pertains to Israel, will tend to portray Israel overall in a negative light. And the 17 of the top 20 websites that the United States, Representative Richie Torres and Representative Chantal Brown. Notably, none of the links were in the top 20, were shared by Jewish advocacy groups, or groups whose job it is to be able to weigh in on these issues. That suggests that the groups that are agitating and the activist groups that are seeking to work on behalf of these causes are not having an impact, and maybe somewhat bubbled in. When we look at the dissemination of terms like apartheid, we want to see who is it that's responsible for most of the chatter, and we find that all of them are accounts that are essentially promoting negative portrayals of the state of Israel. Virtually none of them in the top 10, none of them at all, are accounts that favor Israel when we look at the users who are most prolific in disseminating those terms. Now, one of the things that we can do is we can use natural language processing and machine learning over these comments in order to better ascertain specific kinds of information operations that might be deployed by these individuals. So what we did was we noticed that there was a huge increase in chatter around the term anti-Semitism during this time. And we wanted to characterize what the top associations were with anti-Semitism. So we used a natural language processing algorithm called word-to-back, which allows us to understand how closely associated words are within a given corpus. The top associations for anti-Semitism after the report came out were terms like, it's about the critics. They're weaponizing anti-Semitism. It's a conflation. It's spurious. It's meaningless. This is not a group of marginal extremists. This is the entirety of Twitter. The top associations for anti-Semitism, as this term comes out, are almost uniformly about how meaningless that term is. Now, we can go deeper into the program to understand and create what's called a topic network. This shows and portrays in two dimensions the relationality of language within the corpus in terms of meaning space, and it enriches the nature of the dialogue surrounding anti-Semitism as a seed word. Anti-Semitism is not just a conflation. Apparently it's used to demonize Goyim. A lot of the signals are being sent to the IHRA itself, that the term anti-Semitism is becoming weaponized, that there's a conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, that this is being done politically for convenience, and it's reckless and meaningless. It's actually itself a form of slander. The term itself is a conspiracy to silence the critics of Israel. That's seriously preemptive, right? That suggests that there is a very strong push for people to defang accusations of anti-Semitism, and it's a preemptive form of what I call preemptive meta-discrimination. Preemptive meta-discrimination is a kind of discrimination that ensues not by saying you're hateful and beastly or whatever. It's you portray the other person as being the hater, right? And therefore, victim status can't be attributed to this person who is hateful. They're the powerful person who's hateful. Victim status doesn't apply. That's a scheme. That's a preemptive attack against them being able to be perceived as victims. Because the preemptivity is that they themselves are kind of like the power brokers who are responsible for things. Thus, victim status doesn't apply. So that kind of strategy appears to be a widespread one, and this is not some extremist network. This is across the entirety of Twitter that we're able to see this. So that's really shocking, and it probably leaves Jews really vulnerable, if you might guess. The other thing we can do when this happens is we can do network analysis to understand how the most prominent users are gaining user share in the ecosystem of attention. So this is an interactive network of the top users who disseminated the words apartheid, Israel, Zionism, etc. during the release of the report in the days shortly after. And what we find is that most of the conversation is being driven by these are a few exceptions. Chantal Brown, Ricky Perez, and Mike Pompeo. So the thing about this is that while Amnesty and some of its most closely associated influencers are by and large dominating the conversation, we can see that the people who are really effective at getting through are actually in defending Israel are not Israelis and they're not Jews. They're people who represent groups that are neither one of those things. There is sound psychological reason for this being the case. It's been shown in a number of psychological studies that people who are blatant are less effective at defending themselves because they have a vested interest in doing so. When others speak out on their behalf and they reflect the blame, it's seen as being about the fault in the norms that we all share, and not a personal defense by an individual incentivized to defend themselves. And so one of the things that's notably missing from this graph are any Jewish influencers of any note who are nominally responsible for advocating on behalf of Jews in Israel. I think that's interesting. Finally, we can look at information operation. This includes things like punitive coordinated behaviors. So here's a good example of one. Look at this. This is a hashtag called Israeli Crimes. Would you believe this? Every day at 1600 UTC, a whole bunch of people get on their computer and they all, at the exact same time, every single day, talk about Israeli crimes being a problem. That's amazing. Now, what a coincidence, right? So that's obviously not a coincidence because these obviously aren't people. And they're bots. And what we can see is that this spike from them emerges around February, January, regularly between 1600 and 1700 UTC all at once. This is a violation of the terms of service of Twitter, and it's demonizing Israel. It coincides, actually, with some very interesting stuff. You mentioned the BDS, pre-balance, there's a lot of stuff this massive bot network will tend to sort of get their hands on and push conversation in ways that can try to artificially prefabricating consensus. And it comes from some pretty interesting places. There's some pretty interesting places this place comes from, the network appears to come from. We can then use bot Sentinel, which kind of evaluates bot-like activity and bot-like accounts. And we can take the accounts that are disseminating this, and what we see is that there's a lot of orange and red in this graph, right? And the more orange and red you see, the more bot-like the network is. And there are major nodes in this network that suggest that there's a high degree of bot-like activity in this hashtag. This was one of the top hashtags shared around Twitter during this time, right? That mentioned apartheid, Israel, Zionism, etc. It was one of the top associations with the term apartheid itself. So the thing about this is that these institutional reports, like from places like Amnesty, can actually intercept this coordinated behavior from bot-like accounts in really interesting ways. Because Amnesty itself released a hashtag called End Israeli Apartheid in combination with the report. That was around here. And then something happened between 1600 UTC to 1800 UTC that all of a sudden this bot-like network just came out of nowhere and amplified that exact same hashtag. And wouldn't you know it, that network had a ton of users that also amplified this Israeli crime network thing. So Amnesty's hashtag gets amplified, and you can see that here. Here's the red group with the hashtag, and here's Amnesty, and it's more kind of somewhat authentic users. You can see these are actually distinct networks, but it shows how inauthentic actors can violate Twitter's terms of service, largely from foreign spheres, and they can take messages like the Amnesty report and its accompanying hashtag campaign and amplify it beyond anything Amnesty could do on its own. So that's interesting. And finally, we can do like a comparative analysis. Like, was this necessary? Do people not know that apartheid might be a problem in Israel or something? Maybe they didn't know that, and then this needed to be done because they don't know about all the stuff happening in the West Bank, and people just aren't educated. There are social justice concerns in Israel. Maybe that's the issue. So we did a hashtag analysis with China and Israel in the days before the campaign. And the day before the report was released, we took a 10-day time period, we did a hashtag analysis in January. These are the top associations that were associated with China at that time. There's only 2 social justice hashtags at all, and they don't pertain to anything happening in China. There's a network that was petitioning China to get involved in what was happening in Tigray with the ongoing violence there. Sorry, excuse. My apologies. By contrast, Israel, like half of the hashtags associated with Israel during this time were already about boycotting and divesting and sanctioning from it, and about its indiscriminate acts of killing, including its siege on Gaza, its siege, quote-unquote, on Gaza, and there's Israeli crimes, alive and well. So the interesting thing is that, like, that really the yardstick for this obviously is not about human rights issues, right? And obviously it's not about education either, because people seem to know a lot about how bad things are in Israel way before this report came out, right? Alright, so our assessment is that Amnesty report didn't start to stir significant controversy, but man, it sure is an interesting playbook. It shows this dog whistle effect where it can recruit mass dissemination of a dominance conspiracy in the Twitter sphere. And that really is a kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy in my opinion. Influence operations and putative coordinated online networks can interact with accounts like Amnesty to amplify the reports of propaganda and blame. And much of that content is actually anti-Semitic in nature. I mean, it's even accusing anti-Semitism itself of being a kind of conspiracy. The organic and inorganic amplification dwarfs dissenting voices altogether. There's nothing in this thing that's like a pro-Israel voice from Israel at all. And these effects appear to substantially alter online discourse, and they affect a clear double standard that's fabricated globally across social networks. We see this in Twitter, we see it in a ton of other social networks too. And so that describes how an industry of media can latch onto this stuff and write reports that they know are going to get likes. There's a built-in audience for it, guys. Right? I think it's notable, anyway, I think that there's a couple notable things that come out of there about people that can actually make a difference, or people who need to be concerned about human rights. I think that's the thing that's so, the take-home from this data is that if people are serious about human rights, they should really take a look at what's happening here. Because, this isn't about anti-Semitism. I really actually think it's about human rights. I feel like this is, the people who are pushing on this stuff, the reason to stop them is because it's completely corrupting the language of human rights in ways that go far beyond anything I've shown you here. So, anyway, that's my presentation. Thank you guys for listening. You've been really good.
Just set it for the computer. Thanks, Joel. We have 15 minutes for we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So Ben Freeman will lead off the questions. Go.
This is to you as well.
One sec, Ben. Let me unmute. No, you're good to sit.
I'm getting in line.
I'm not getting any questions.
You missed the hand clapping and hear the questions.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Hey, so thank you so much for that. This is a question to both of you. What is the advice that you may have for people who are online? Because I am fairly active online and I have had my account suspended. I have posts removed. In the last 24 hours, I've seen 2 kind of Jewish advocates online had their accounts shut down. Do you have any advice for how people handle this? Because it seems to be a numbers game. There's just not, as you point out, Joel, the influencers or the advocates online aren't even making a splash. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's my question.
Is that directed to me? I assume it is.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess you're asking the biggest question, right? You're going right to the biggest question. So, what do we do about all this?
Yeah. Precisely.
So, I think that's the best question. That's the best question. I feel I feel like we are with the, okay, this is how I'm going to answer that. I feel like we are with the social media platforms where we were with the tobacco companies back in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
This stuff is bad, it's really, really bad. And it's not just bad for Jews.
No.
It's bad for everybody.
Yeah.
Have you seen what TikTok is doing to little girls? Like, have you seen what's happening? Like, there is evil on YouTube that doesn't sleep.
Yeah.
Right? And people are getting, like, day in and day out, they're spending time on this thing. It's not good for people.
No.
You know, it's not good. It's really, really not good for people.
Mm.
So that's obvious, and whatever needs to happen, like, as usual, anti-Semitism is just a symptom. It's a symptom of a kind of something that's like systematically dehumanizing us.
Mm.
So we have to think about, that's what I mean about this being a problem about human rights, right? Like, that's what I mean. Like, this really is an issue, but I don't think it's the issue we think it is.
Okay.
So we have to address the fundamental problems in the business model of social media. And we have to be able to sort of like find a way to make sure that people have a more participatory role in their lives. And they're not just voyeurs of endless material that are being fed back like cows and grazing on that, because that's not what a human being is.
Yeah.
And until we change that, I don't really see how that's going to change, and whose job is it to change that? Well, my guess is that you ask what you can do. Okay, so, you know, I think that just like when there's a virus out there, there's a number of ways to answer that question. Get a mask on. Start with that. You know, start with the hygiene of this stuff. And like I think that's like, you know, and then find other sane people of sound mind to find ways to push against the big problems.
Okay.
I think that's what I'm doing.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate your answer.
You're very welcome.
Can you get it?
Is it okay? Thank you. Hi to both of you. Thank you both for these presentations. It's very timely for a purely selfish reason. I'm a scholar in Canada, and I've just been asked by the Canadian government to consult with them on proposed hate crime legislation on the internet. And this is not my area, so I'm so grateful to get these presentations from both of you. And I want to give you a moment to say, like, what would you tell the Canadian government? Is there anything that can be legislated? Do you see anything that is so clear and egregious that with our scholarly concerns about free speech, you still can point to something that can be done? Is there a... It's kind of horrible putting you on the spot this way, but I'm really concerned.
I'm so glad we're asking those questions because they're the hardest to answer. Like, of course they are, but I feel like, you know, we're at a point we need you thinking. Look, I've developed proposals on this with others that I think, you know, there's sensible policy changes we can make that could have an impact in the online world. But they require, look, one of the things that's missing is that, like, when you think about a referee, like, a referee has a few limitations. First of all, they can't be in the game. That's one of the things, a referee cannot play in the game. A good ref has got to be in the game and not on either team's side, right? Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's obviously missing is having a believable referee in the online domain. That's completely missing. And a referee's uniform is really important. It's like, what's the black stripe and what's the white stripe, right? Like, how do you separate that out? How do you make the calls? So I think we need institutions that are believable and credible for being able to make those kinds of discriminations in ways that are representative of people's norms. And what's important is that organization has to have enough buy-in and popular support and really, really, really be something that's apolitical. The government's not credible for doing that. Because what we've seen is that as governments get involved in the policing disinformation game, then, you know, one person's fact becomes another person's disinformation campaign. And I will be the judge of that, thank you very much. So what I'm advising the Canadian government to do, what I've advised them to do, is to create an independent, non-governmental organization that actually is responsible for doing this and is fundamentally driven by adversarial collaboration. It's fundamentally driven in ways that you know, are duly representative of the arguments that people are having and it can be seen as even fair amount. Now, that seems like it's like, oh, who does that? But we do that all the time with things that matter, like the Federal Reserve, and we have private organizations that govern conflict. Say, Charles?
You sure? Aye. No, I was just going to say very quickly in response to your very important question and mandate. You know, Joel, I don't mean to insult you, but thank God in Canada we have hate legislation and there are limits of freedom of speech, unlike the First Amendment in the United States. And there have been instances where information coming from servers in the United States has been deemed as hate speech, and they've been blocked. Yep. So there is a bit of a potential for more traction to deal responsibly with speech in Canada. And I know people that are engaged in the Canadian context, and I'd be happy to speak with you. And I believe that Canada can become a beacon of having a democracy with free speech, but never allowing or limiting the capacity to incite against identifiable groups with hatred. That's against the law in Canada. So I think we could become a beacon potentially for the world given that model. But I digress. Mr. Southwell.
You're so much better at saying this stuff than I am, Charles. No wonder they put you in front of all these lawmakers.
First, I think Charles and I could have a nice debate on hate speech and the appropriateness of banning it by law. But I want to ask. I want to make just a brief comment and then ask you a question. The brief comment is there was a remarkable statement last month on Twitter by the Secretary General of the United Nations. I don't know if you saw this. Antonio Guterres tweeted out of the blue, ostensibly, that 1/5 of all comments on Twitter, not 1/5 of all comments about Jews on Twitter, or 1/5 of all comments about the Holocaust on Twitter, but that 1/5 of all comments on Twitter were Holocaust denial or distortion. You check it. I can send it around if you'd like to see it. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. I was blown away. I'm happy to. I'm happy to send it to you. That's what I wanted to ask, whether or not you thought this was even remotely accurate.
Look, I can show you right now. We can do it right now. Hold on a second.
You don't have to debate with me. I can debate with the United Nations. I'm happy to send you Guterres' quote.
Let me just. Oh, by the way, I want to show you guys something. Check this out. So here's happening like right now on Twitter. So after that Israeli operation, here's the end Israeli apartheid hashtag. Here's Israeli crimes, right? These guys recirculate this stuff all the time. Israeli terrorism, free Palestine. So, but then here's Holocaust, it barely registers.
Right. That's what I thought. So I will send Charles the tweet, and you can debunk it. So, but my question for you, I mean, I heard two remarkably sophisticated technical projects, but actually addressing two very different types of issues. And so my question for you, which I thought it was a fascinating look at how anti-Semitism metastasizes online by looking at these comments, but how do we know if these are not just, fringe people talking to fringe people over and over and over again? How do we know the qualitative value of this, which is slightly different than this other study, which takes a look at which are the most influential mainstream influencers? I think what you just did is terrific to look at how things evolve and let you know where it's heading. But how do you look at the sort of relevance of who these people are?
Yeah. Part of the issue is we don't look at the individual, right? For ethical reasons, we have all these comments and stuff, and we don't try and judge whether a comment is anti-Semitic or not based on the identity of the person making it, right? We're trying to think of anti-Semitism as a kind of objective phenomena that you can express anti-Semitism without being conscious of it yourself, without in any way being a anti-Semite. I think it's important to distinguish the two things between anti-Semitism on one hand and being an anti-Semite on the other. because I don't think they necessarily always match. In terms of whether the people we're looking at are extremists, the comments that we're getting are similar to what he's looking at. He's looking at Twitter. We look at Twitter. We look at responses to, Guardian, BBC, Devout, kind of French mainstream newspapers and stuff, including their comment threads and on their own sites and on the Facebook threads. And it may be that they are invaded by people who are kind of, radical and obsessed with this stuff, and a lot of them are obsessed with it. But a lot of it, you can just tell from the way it's written. There are people who are interested in the topic, particularly the Israel-Palestine stuff, but they're pretty standard ways of talking about it. It's nothing, or maybe I would argue that maybe the distinction between extremists and mainstream is not quite as distinct as we might think, and the ideas kind of float between those milieus. I mean, an interesting project would be to look at the way that Israel, for example, gets spoken about in kind of explicitly extremist milieus, and compare with the linguistic structure of the way that they talk about it with how it's used in kind of, the Guardian comment section, and see whether there's any differences there or whether they flow. But and the other problem is that I think that these comments are there on publicly accessible Facebook pages or Twitter pages forever until they're deleted. So it may be, yes, this one conversation that you're looking at might be by a couple of people who are a bit crazy and are just completely obsessed with it. But what they're saying exists forever and ever and ever, and can be accessed by pretty much anyone who looks at the comment thread. So I think maybe that this kind of, radical disjuncture between, extremists and mainstream people doesn't quite hold in terms of the way that the internet works now, I think.
So if I could comment on that, I think that our studies have shown, we got our start back in Pittsburgh with the attack on the synagogue, and we reported 2 weeks before that happened in the Washington Post that we felt a spill out of violence was imminent on this platform that the attack came from, and that it would be based on this replacement theory stuff that it was, and that and it would be anti-Semitic, and it was. So that's how we got our start. And, the thing is that what people need to understand is that there are two systems of distinct violence. They converge in the end, but they're really distinct. The extremist stuff that we're seeing now on the right is stylized very differently than what's happening on the left. And the competing systems work in the following fashion. On the right, you see marginal subcultural forums that are countercultural, that generate deeply coded language in bizarre ways, that can get a few actors to be able to be celebrated in the lineage of heroes by taking out numbers of Jews, or by perpetrating attacks and disseminating anti-Semitic conspiracy and romanticize their visions, right? And that gets that trickles up, so to speak, and allows for leaders to take advantage of the coded language. There's a whole ecosystem that can generate a highly racialized version of anti-Semitism. So on the left, it's far more diffuse, right? Instead, what you have is that you have a kind of a system of anti-Semitism that's encoded in the language of social justice. It's fabricated largely through an authoritarian history with the Soviets and fabricated through that lineage. And its focus is so asymmetrically on Jewish nationalism, but ultimately it argues it's not anti-Semitic in theory, but it sure is in practice. When we see surges of this activity, of the activity that I mentioned online, it doesn't happen in subcultural forums. It happens in the culture, because that's the culture, not the counterculture. Mm-hmm. And when it gets in the atmosphere, Jews get attacked. And their code words come from the academy, not from these underground subcultural forums. With a high priest class that has an intellectual designation to be able to articulate equal terms and get away with it because it sounds funny. So I think that basically describes and characterizes the two different systems, but I think they're both demonstrably anti-Semitic, and that can help us parameterize how we're thinking about the problem.
Joel, what are the terms you're referring to? Terms like what?
I mean, a lot of the stuff on the left is couched in identitarian language from diversity and inclusion and that kind of material. So the poisoning of terms like colonial, the way that the Jew is considered white,
Hi. So I have a question for each of you.
That's not part of the discourse.
Your process is profoundly labor intensive at the beginning. And you said you hope that, eventually you'll have an AI machine learning that'll be able to sort of take over that stuff, that part of it. How sure are you you're going to last long enough before you get to that? Because that's a very big deal.
Well, it would never be that the AI takes over completely because it's changing. So you constantly have to feed it with new.
I know, but that's a problem in and of itself.
In terms of getting an AI that works, and in terms of getting one that you could use, actually that Facebook could buy and use, I don't know, 10 years, I don't know. But there are people who are working on these things now who are getting more and more effective on it. Okay. So I think you could get to a point where you start integrating some of those insights over the next few years, I think. Okay. But the other way of doing it is that we think you can do better training of the humans who are making these decisions at Twitter.
You're training the data so that the data can do that.
No. So we're trying to publish our guidebook that we use when we annotate our comments, which then you could use for training Facebook moderators, Twitter moderators. So they actually recognise. Okay. So some of the more glaring examples, when you think this is clearly anti-Semitic, what is wrong with you? That would. So already you can make an impact that way, I think.
All right, Joel. One word that didn't appear in what you said at any time, interestingly enough, in some way, was accountability. And what I'm talking about accountability is for those who do what we are talking about, right? Everyone gets away with murder, period, right?
Yeah, totally.
And
totally right. I mean, look, that's where I think this could be useful. Like, if we can show that these things are connected to anti-Semitic attacks, if we can show that, it's like CO2 in the atmosphere or cigarette smoke in your lungs. That's what this stuff is like. And what we need to be able to figure out is, when is a platform accountable, right? We figured out when our newspaper is accountable. We invented a term for that. It's called incitement for genocide.
Yes, but...
Right? That's obviously happening. That's obviously happening.
But in the old days, people would be put in the stocks. And you would come and throw stuff at them. You would shame people, right? I mean, sorry, but they did. That used to happen a lot, right? Nobody's shamed. You get away with anything. You can send out a death threat. You can do all this stuff, and it's just nowhere. People are becoming more and more afraid to step up to do things, right? So, where is the equivalent, or how do we get the equivalent of putting people in the stocks? Putting companies in the stocks, right? Making them accountable. That's what I care about.
Yeah, that's totally a great question. I think that's the right question.
Thank you. Final question. We're running out of time. Chelsea.
Okay.
Sorry, Ashley.
Hi. I don't know if you can see me right now, but I think we just emailed recently. So, and I've been following your work for a while, so it's very interesting to me. But this is a question for both of you guys. So do you guys think that using AI technology to track anti-Semitism sort of on an ongoing, long-term basis could actually be used as a tool for foreign policy as well to predict global escalations, per se, and conflicts that are infused with anti-Semitism, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in general the rise of totalitarianism? So have you thought of those implications? And also, is that a direction that your organizations are looking into going as well?
Yeah, do you mind if I take the first shot at that, Charles?
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Go ahead.
Definitely, I mean, that's 100% a thing. And, one of the things we're doing is we just showed you these topic networks that we're developing over online material, and we've used those to sort of rapidly dissect and contextualize different narratives. Well, we're doing the exact same thing with Nazi newspapers and Soviet newspapers. We're doing the exact same thing with, literature from various fields. Our goal is to be able to look at that in its totality and create a genealogy of hatred. And we need that not because we need a history lesson, guys. We need it to detect this stuff. And we need to see the influence that it's had in the real world and use it for creating transparency. That is going to give us better capability to detect this stuff now. But we've been lying to ourselves for so long that we need some really, really shrewd analysis to show how we've been doing that. And uncover exactly what the genealogy history of this stuff is so that we can really expose it now.
Thanks, Joel. Matthew, final word.
Final word. Yeah, I do think it would be very useful for tracking social trends and seeing the spread of ideas. I'm personally I think the link between what happens online and when you're talking about major geopolitical events, invasions, I think there needs to be a lot more study of how these two things relate, because I don't think it necessarily there's a big surge of people talking about something on Twitter and then
I guess because we were talking
No,
about
excuse,
how
we
a
have
lot
to,
of-
no, we can't continue. Let them ask the question and we got to break.
but yes, I do think tracking these social trends is important, but there are other layers of analysis that have to be brought in as well, I think. But yeah.
Cool. So thank you. So Joel and Matthew, thank you very much for a wonderful contribution. Okay, so our week is over. Daphne has Daphne or El Shaday's final comments.
Not to them. It's all good.
It's all, I thought you wanted to say something.